Media in New Jersey, a closer look, next on Carpe Diem.
Carpe Diem is funded in part by The Record and the Herald News.
Since the passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the pace of media consolidation has increased rapidly. Today, in fact, relatively few companies control a multitude of television, radio stations, newspapers, magazines, and other media. I'm Bill Berlin, your host for Carpe Diem. Joining me today to talk about the impact of consolidation and other trends on New Jersey media is Richard Lee, Communications Director for the Hall Institute of Public Policy of New Jersey. Richard, nice having you on.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
First of all, what's the Hall Institute?
The Hall Institute is a relatively new public policy institute focusing on New Jersey issues. We were established about 2 years ago by a philanthropist named George Hall, who lives in Monmouth County. He has a successful hedge fund company in New York, and he always wanted to become involved in public policy. So he started the Hall Institute, hired Michael Rickards, a former college president, to be our executive director. I had a background in communications and politics in New Jersey, so he needed someone who had the government and political contacts. So I've been doing that. I do a lot of the publicity, and in addition to some research for the Hall Institute. Michael, from his background as a college president, has a number of academic contacts. So between the two of us, we're pretty happy with where we are after 2 years. We've just come up with what we believe are the key issues in New Jersey, and they're what you would expect: education, healthcare, the environment, taxes, and we have sections on our website for each of them where people can write papers really of any length. They run from op-ed length all the way up to white papers.
Mm-hmm. And you also sort of sponsor or create a whole series of events, I'm assuming, as well?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Initially, our focus was on the website, but now that that is up and running, we're starting to do some special projects. The most recent one was in the fall of 2006. We did an online virtual debate for New Jersey's U.S. Senate campaign, which we were very proud of, the fact that we were able to get the candidates to focus on the issues. We ran it like a regular debate. We would submit a question to them. They had a week to do a 1,000-word response. There were rebuttals. People could send in suggestions for questions and topics. And as I'm sure you recall, last year's Senate campaign, there was not a lot of focus on issues and what we read in the media.
Right.
And we got that onto our website. By the time Election Day came, we had a nice body of work. If somebody was interested in knowing where Bob Menendez or Tom Kean Jr. stood on immigration, Social Security, it was all there. And interestingly, towards the end of the campaign, we even had reporters calling us who said, I'm getting more information about where these guys stand on the issues than I get when I talk to them personally. So
that's great.
Yeah.
You also do some other stuff that's kind of different and pretty interesting. I've seen, at least on your website, there are pieces there about Bruce Springsteen, Frank Sinatra,
right.
The Irish in New Jersey. So it's sort of a potpourri of cultural, political, social things.
Yes, definitely. We're trying to bridge the gap between, there's a lot of really good academic scholarly work being done, and I think a lot of it doesn't get to people who would be interested in that. So with the pieces that you mentioned, what we do sometimes, we do research, we see who's written about these issues, and sometimes we'll either post the articles themselves or one of us will summarize the articles and try to make them relevant to our readers. And sometimes we found that professors have written things maybe years ago and suddenly they become topical again. That was the case going back before the Senate election when Menendez was appointed by the governor to fill actually Corzine's own Senate seat. I found a number of papers that were written by political science professors on U.S. senators who were appointed to fill vacancies and the differences between being an appointed senator and an elected professor, senator. And we posted those. I summarized them, and as I said, a couple of the professors said, like, I wrote this 10 or 15 years ago, but suddenly it's topical again. So we're always on the lookout for things like that.
And your own background, you have a background in journalism. You
Yes.
mentioned that. Tell me something about that.
Well, I worked as a journalist for about 15 years. I held a variety of jobs. I actually started right here in Montclair. My first job was with the Montclair Times.
Really?
I was there for a number of years.
Good paper.
Yes, it's
good paper.
you know, in terms of weeklies, I believe it's one of the better ones in the state. And it was a good place to start out because, again, as I'm sure you know, Montclair is a community that has a lot of well-known people. I know in our readership, you know, at that time, I think we've had about a half a dozen New York Times reporters. So,
right.
you know, that was a good place to start. I you know, worked briefly in corporate public relations, did really not care for it, and then kind of did an about-face and went from there, became a rock music critic for a paper called the Aquarian Weekly, which was, I had always been interested in music, and it in many ways was a dream job. I was paid for going to concerts, interviewing rock stars, listening to records, or it was vinyl back at that time. And unfortunately, the paper had some financial difficulties. I had started freelancing for a paper called the News Tribune in Woodbridge, which since has merged with the Home News in New Brunswick, and started covering meetings. One thing led to another that eventually became a part-time job and then a full-time job. And I had a number of beats, ended up covering politics, and was working in the State House Bureau, which is how I switched from there into government public relations.
Well, let's talk about that. You've written a lot about the media in New Jersey, and also particularly written on newspapers, given your background,
Yes.
et cetera. I think I saw a figure, maybe it was in something you wrote, that in 1970 or so we had 33 daily newspapers
Correct.
in New Jersey, and today we have
I believe
17, 14?
There's 19.
There's 19?
And 14 of them are owned by two different chains, by
chains.
Gannett and Advanced Publications.
So what's going on with newspapers in the state? Where are we going?
Well, it's very similar to what's happening nationally, as you alluded to in your introduction, where you have 5 or 6 large international corporations controlling all the media. And in some of the papers that I've done, I've looked at what's happening nationally and applied it to New Jersey, and we really seem to be mirroring what's happening across the nation. We now have, as I said, 19 daily newspapers, but for all practical purposes, 14 of them are really the same papers. You know, pick up a Gannett paper, whether it's the Camden Courier Post or the Courier News or the Home News Tribune, and you may see the same story in all of them. Advance, which is the Star Ledger, Trenton Times, and some of the smaller South Jersey papers, to a certain degree, you know, keep some independence. You won't see the exact same story, although recently they've consolidated a number of their operations with the Trenton Times.
But local stories might be different from place to place, or paper to
yes.
paper. Yeah.
Well, local stories are different, but one of the things that I've looked at, local stories, the number of them is being diminished, you know, because that's really what suffers.
From consolidation.
Yes,
Yeah.
because it's cheaper, and you know, these places are businesses. They're profit driven. You know, just if you can have one reporter write a story that's going to appear in 5 of your papers, it's more cost effective than having 5 reporters report on 5 different things. And the problem with that is the news becomes somewhat homogenized.
Right,
You know,
right.
You'll read the same budget story in all of the Gannett papers, whereas if you had an individual reporter from each of those papers, he or she would probably be looking for things that are particularly relevant to their own readership.
But these papers, even the chain papers, I would guess, still attract local advertising.
Yes, they do.
Local classified advertising.
Yes.
Yeah. Which financially they have to have. They can't do without that stuff.
Right. It's you know, as I said, it's all profit driven, and you know, in addition to the classified advertising, you know, this goes back to one of the other papers that I've written, because the industry is so profit driven. The demographics that they shoot for are the ones who are going to buy the products, who are advertising there, and that, you know, has a spin-off effect into the type of stories that get covered and the stories that don't get covered.
So a lot of the focus would be aimed, let's say, at a more well-to-do suburban population, because that's where the money is, that's where, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
more consumerism there, et cetera, and so
Right.
forth.
In fact, if you were to, you know, pick up an ad kit from any of these places, as I've done, say when we've been interested in advertising, or even a number of them, you can go online and go to their advertising sections, and you'll see right in there that they talk about their audience, and you'll see wordings like, you know, we have a large suburban affluent audience. Our readers typically are people who buy big ticket items, expensive luxury cars, so that if you're a potential advertiser, you know these are the people who you're going to be reaching through that newspaper.